It's time. It's time for you to live better.
It's time for you to feel healthier.
It's time for you to live longer.
It's time for you to enjoy your journey.
It's time for you to understand your body and your mind. Thank you so much for joining us on It's Time today. We are your hosts. I'm Linsly Donnelly, your citizen scientist and your longevity expert for midlife women.
And I'm Dr. Jen Wagner, physician and holistic performance expert. Welcome to It's Time, powered by Prosper. Just a quick reminder, the information discussed in this podcast is for informational and educational purposes only. We are not offering medical advice, nor are we entering into any type of physician or clinician relationship with listeners. Always consult your healthcare provider before beginning any new fitness, nutrition, or lifestyle changes to ensure they're right for you. Your health and safety is our priority, and let's keep it that way. Thank you.
All right. So Jen, we hear this buzzword all the time, longevity, longevity, longevity. What is longevity? What's it about?
You know, I think there's this new push and this new idea that we are living longer, especially as women.
Right.
We are living longer. And what does that mean? I mean, I think neither one of us want to age the way we've seen a lot of examples age.
Right.
And so to me, longevity means matching my health span to my lifespan, that I want to be going and doing the things I want to do till my last day.
Well, I mean, you talk about health span and lifespan. I mean, lifespan is something we've heard before, like how long do you live? And when we started to look at this, we were working with women here in Park City. What struck me was that the average lifespan, like right around the 1900s, turn of the century, was sub 50 years old.
Right.
So as a 55-year-old, that was a little jarring to look at. And then to see kind of what took it from 55 to, I think now it's like 78-ish. Questions around, has that changed with COVID and opioid addictions? But kind of staying around the 78 years old. And they were pretty big levers, like sanitation and vaccines, but it was slow. Like, you know, you went from 50 to 78 over 110 years, 120 years. And now we're seeing lifespan being forecasted by very reputable health organizations like the Cleveland Health Clinic to be 114. And I think the stat that sticks with me is there's a 50% chance, if you're 50 years old today, that you're going to live to be 114.
Yeah,
so that's
crazy.
Lifespan. That's not how you're living. Like your point on health span. Talk to us about health span.
So I think health span is making sure all of those years you're in the best health possible. And so instead of this idea at 60, you retire and you slow down and you stop doing things because they're too dangerous and you might get hurt and you kind of take on this frail old person persona. It is, health span is picking now what you want to be doing at 60, at 80, at 100, and then working towards those goals. And so really it's about preventing, and we're going to get into what the four horsewomen, we're going to say horsewomen today. The four horsewomen of death are, which that sounds so negative and sad, but we're going to talk about some of that and really saying, okay, you know, Dr. Peter Attia really talks about the Centurion Decathlon. What do you want to be doing at a certain age? So how do we reverse engineer that to where we need to be right now?
Yeah, and the eye-opening thing for us as we were looking at this is, okay, so, you know, if you're 50 right now, and you say, I want to be doing something at 70, at 90, at 110, what you're saying is, I want to be doing something kind of like I am right now. But the reality is, if you want to be doing it like you are right now, you have to be doing it at 30% more right now so that you can get there.
Absolutely.
This idea that there's no way to outrun the effects of aging. We're going to have degradation every decade. We can blunt it, but we can't erase it. So you're setting up a foundation, like a principle in a bank account, and the bank account is you and your life. And you have to build that principle big enough now to be able to generate that interest in the future, or else you kind of wake up the equivalent of bankrupt. You know, you can breathe till you're 114, but you sure didn't enjoy that ride.
Right. So let's talk about how we kind of get there. And I think, you know, we've both read some things recently where women on average are going to live almost 1,600 days longer than men.
Right.
That's a long time, but yet we spend 25% of that in poor health. And we know we don't age in a linear fashion. And so we definitely have an acceleration in our aging process right around perimenopause. There was actually, I just read an article, I think it was in National Geographic even, about these two kind of super aging ages between, in our 40s and then again in our 60s. And women, we also have one kind of in our 50s.
Yes. Yes. And, we can't reverse time, right? Like we can't do what we, at 30, what we're hearing now would have been awesome that we did do. And of course we can tell our younger colleagues and our daughters to do these things because you're building an even bigger compounding baseline. But we can start to blunt the effects of aging by coming in on some pretty simple levers, which is what we want to spend more time at the end of our talk today. But the idea that we can get across the line, and I think when we talked about it a few months ago, it was this idea of binary intentionality. Like some women say when we share this stat with them, hey, I'm just going to be exhausted. I can't live that long. That sounds horrible. But the reality is it may not be a choice. Like you just might be living that long. So you might as well bet on yourself. Like it's not like you get to actually tap out and say, I don't want to live in poor health from 80 to 114. But what you do get to do is say, I'm going to bet on myself to be enjoying that by doing a few things that are critical right now.
Absolutely.
Every day from now until then.
Right. So let's go through the 4 things that most commonly knock us out.
Yeah. That's so depressing, but it's better to name them and pretend they're not there. Yes.
So, I think this is still new to a lot of people, but that cardiovascular disease is the number 1 killer of women.
Right. And I think that is new because it's such a stereotype that it's men and it presents the same way in men. And so it's new news that it is actually number 1 killer for women and it doesn't show up the same way.
It doesn't show up the same way. And the disease process is actually different. It's very accelerated in women because of estrogen's protective effects. We're blunted and shielded from a lot of cardiovascular disease etiologies for a long time. And then when we start to lose estrogen and progesterone's protective effects is when we really see this uptick in cardiovascular disease, especially our cholesterol changes. It becomes much more atherogenic. Our blood vessels are much more susceptible to building plaques and things like that. So we actually can really accelerate that disease process. And I think we're just beginning to understand that. And so what does that mean? Does that mean we need to be more aggressive treating cholesterol in women as we're entering this perimenopause transition? We talked about, do we need to get coronary calcium scores earlier, which is a quick CT scan to look and to see if there are mature plaques in your vessels, in your coronary vessels. So there's things we can do. And I don't think we quite know. I don't think the screening algorithms for women have been created yet. And so it is really advocating for yourself. I can speak for myself personally. I have a horrible family history of cardiovascular disease. My dad had his first heart attack in his 40s. And so I asked my physician to do a really deep dive in my cholesterol and go beyond just the HDL and the LDL and look at things like Lp(a), which is the most atherogenic component of our cholesterol. And you only need it measured once. It's genetically influenced. Mine's like off the charts.
Yeah.
And it's difficult to know what to do with that because we don't have any drugs designed to treat it. But it does tell me, okay, I need to control every lifestyle factor I can control. I should be controlling because I know I have this risk factor sitting there.
Yeah.
And I ended up, for my personal self, it was to go on a statin earlier before my other cholesterol numbers would have ever indicated I needed one, in an effort to try to minimize any of the other risks that I could.
Yeah. So, I think the takeaway, as we're having this conversation with people, is asking a set of questions around cardiovascular disease and the risks that are there, especially when you're peri and postmenopause. It's a new thing to tie together in your annual checkup. So we'll put it in the show notes. Because you don't want to be trying to pull the car off the road right now or stop your run or whatever you're doing to write all this down. But there are a set of questions that would feel new to you in that checkup. So that's the first one, cardiovascular disease.
Yes. And I think one more thing on that before we move on to number 2 is women with heart attacks present differently too. Right. And I think the medical system is getting better at identifying that, but it's often these more vague symptoms. Sometimes pain's more up in the jaw than classically down the arm. Sometimes it's more nausea and vomiting. And kind of a feeling of impending doom. A lot of women who've had heart attacks or I've talked to just said, I know I don't feel right and something feels like something bad's really about to happen to me. And I think a lot of times those symptoms were dismissed as anxiety.
Sure.
And there is definitely an overlap. But I think that just honoring your body and knowing your body and saying something feels different, and making sure that, I think the medical community is getting more adept at saying cardiovascular disease looks different in women. Yeah. We need to make sure when they come in with symptoms that may not check every box that we're still investigating.
Yep. I think both of us have more than enough examples to fill a hand of people who've gone in and they've said, thank goodness you did, because had you not, you would be dead.
Right.
So taking it seriously and taking yourself seriously is really hard to do when you're in the world of women's health and for yourself. Okay, so let's go with number 2.
So cancer. And I think everyone used to think this is number 1.
Yeah.
But it's still, the longer we live, especially women, the higher our risk becomes, just with degradation of DNA over time. And so continuing to make sure you're doing cancer screening is really important.
So it's one that's kind of hard to be preventative, other than the basic 4 pillars we're going to talk about at the end here, but continuing to feed into diet, nutrition, moving, and sleeping. Yeah.
So I think with that, colonoscopies, mammograms, I think the other really important one that we sometimes forget about is skin.
Oh, right.
Like to have your skin checked once a year. Yeah. And there's some different commercial tools that are becoming available, but I mean, it's even something you can do with your partner.
Yeah.
Take picture of your back, and just to make sure that, your skin is looking okay.
Back and ears.
Ears,
yeah. Driving in your car. Yeah. The other one that I thought was kind of new news for me, again, being 55, was that mammograms start at 40 now, and colonoscopies often as well. So it's not just, a 50-year-old milestone. It's 10 years earlier.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Number 3.
Cognition. Again, this is a disease, when we talk about dementia and neurocognitive decline, this is something that out of proportion affects women.
So I think I saw the stats, and it was something like 70% of Alzheimer's patients are female.
Yes.
That's staggering, because you hear about Alzheimer's, it's really a female disease.
It is. And what's really interesting is, again, we think it's losing the protective effects, some of the neuroprotective effects of female sex hormones, because it's not exactly, it's not just because we're living longer. So women become increasingly susceptible to neurocognitive decline in menopause.
Right.
And so again, it goes back to the kind of the big 4 pillars that we're going to talk about, which is the best prevention for this. And then I think with that sneak peek, I think sleep is probably one of the most critical things we're finding.
I know there's been a lot of interest, and we'll have an entire episode around different testing and assessments you can do. There's been a lot of interest in the genetic testing to see if you have the gene and 1 or 2 of the markers for Alzheimer's. But there's also the good news that the reality is, even if you do, so much of it is lifestyle driven.
Correct.
And like all these things, the earlier you do the lifestyle lever intervention, the better your odds are to be able to come out the other end of that with a thrival.
Absolutely.
All right, so the 4th one, the big one.
Metabolic disease. So this is diabetes, obesity, something that definitely plagues us in this country. And again, when we lose estrogen, we tend to, our glucose metabolism and our insulin sensitivity tend to go down. So we tend to not use glucose as effectively. Our glucose levels go up. We become insulin insensitive. This is when we often see the belly weight gain or the belly fat. So again, luckily, the same 4 things that we've talked about work to prevent this as well. But I think what's interesting for women is when we get into these changes in metabolism, we can actually change the way we move a little bit to overcome some of these issues that we're going to talk about, with adding more resistance training, adding more polarized training. And what we mean by that is doing something at really high intensity, balancing it with something that's really low intensity, and kind of staying out of this gray middle zone where we were all told our whole lives that's where we should exercise. So it's learning how to kind of create that high and that low instead of always being in the middle.
Yeah, and that is absolutely worth 2 or 3 episodes, because it was a game changer for me, right? Somebody in my teens and 20s, all about a certain type of exercise for a certain type of minutes every single day, and how that interacted with food. And that recipe changes, especially post-menopause. So I'm excited for us to have our episode on that. I guess the 5th thing that is not one of the 4 horsewomen, but the 5th thing that is a game changer and how you start to build your foundation right now is the impact of falling. So the stats that we saw in this, which is over the age of 60, if you fall, there's like a 70% mortality rate post-fall.
Yeah, the morbidity rate is really high. So morbidity is kind of contributing to death versus mortality, dying. Okay. And the morbidity rate is really high. The percentages is well in the 70s or 80s of people that fall that never return home after a fall. Wow. And the decline and acceleration of other disease processes. You fall, you're immobile, you get a blood clot, you have a stroke. Like all of those things tend to accelerate after a fall.
So they get classified in those 4 horsewomen, but they got catalyzed by falling.
Right.
And so, we're going to again talk about the things to do to prevent falling and having strong bones so that it's not a life ender if you crack one, or you hopefully don't crack
Exactly.
one. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, so I know we keep sort of teasing that we're going to get into the 4 things that matter, but before we do, maybe we sort of clear the air about some of the noise and distractions around some exciting things that are emerging modalities, but some that are just kind of a waste of thought and trial and laboratories.
Yeah, and I think, this field of longevity, and we've talked about this, it's ever shifting because one, it's kind of new. 10 years ago, people really weren't talking about this, or it was a very, very small group of people that were talking about it.
They were calling it geriatric studies, right? Which is so
right.
That's not exciting. I'm not going to go.
You were still thinking of like the little old lady with her white hair shuffling around. And so, I think it has kind of burst on the scene. And this is kind of an interesting cross dynamic between traditional medicine and, to be honest with you, kind of the commercial world and where these are blending. And so, there's been a lot of science devoted to this lately. And I think it's really hard to do a lot of these studies in humans because who's going to pay for it? And who's going to keep it ongoing? You need several generations of researchers committed to the same thing to be able to follow people long enough to see the long-term effects. So we then have to translate from other organisms that have shorter life cycles. So we're going to talk about a few different things. I think, what was really big a few years ago, probably was exciting for all of us, was resveratrol.
Right. Well, I think there were a couple of them when you bring that up. There's like this whole category of things that are pharmaceuticals,
yes.
Right? That's the magic
yes.
bullet, the silver bullet. So, and the resveratrol being one. Right?
Yeah. So resveratrol, the skin of red grapes. So this was great. It kind of came about with the French paradoxes. They had these, societies and groups in France that were living a really long time. And what was it? And they were like, well, they're eating, they kind of had a high fat, high cholesterol diet, a lot of cheese, a lot of bread, like a lot of things like that. But yet they were drinking all this red wine. Oh, it must be the wine.
Right.
So a lot of excitement about resveratrol. And basically no one else was able to recreate those studies. Right. So one study showed a positive effect on aging. No one else could recreate it. And the doses that were required in that study, I mean, you'd be drinking gallons of wine.
which is a lot, even for the biggest fan.
Yeah.
Right? To have to do that.
So that one is pretty much fallen out of favor.
So the other one that I feel like I heard a lot about, and you still see it like at the IV drips and over the counter, and it's marketed to the general public as just life extending, slowing aging, life extending, and it's either single or bundled together, like NMN, NAD, NAD plus, NR. This is all about, this will stop aging.
Yeah. So NAD plus is a molecule that is essential for life. Right. It is involved in so many reactions in the body. And if we didn't have it, we would die within seconds. We also know it's a molecule that degrades with age. But it's biochemically incredibly complex. And I am not a biochemist. I've read a lot about it, but the reason you see it in so many different formulations is because we can't actually absorb NAD plus.
Okay.
So if we take NAD plus, we can absorb it. NAD plus is actually not really found in our bloodstream. So what happens is these precursors, so MNN, all these different precursors that you can take, get to the liver, it gets turned into NAD plus.
Okay.
But then it has to get transformed again before it can go into the blood to be transported. Then it goes back into a cell in the body and gets transformed again. So it's a very energetically heavy process, expensive process to do that. we don't, again, because, and the other interesting thing about NAD is it's been classified as a supplement. Okay. So we really don't have any studies on it. Yeah. It's not controlled by the FDA. It's available ubiquitously in different formulations. And so I think that is one of the things. Is it doing harm? We kind of don't know.
But it seems like it's a lot of work.
But it's a lot of work, and we're not sure it actually gets to the places to make a difference. Yeah. And then we're not actually sure if it's actually NAD going down. Are we using more? Are we producing less? We actually don't quite understand the aging physiology behind the change in level. So supplementing it even makes a difference.
Okay, so I think there are two others that feel like there's some positive signal on, and we hear about them in a lot of podcasts or read about them in a lot of articles. One is metformin. So let's start with that one.
Okay. So metformin's a drug that's been along a long, long time, has a really solid safety record. It's used in type 2 diabetics. It's used to increase insulin sensitivity, decrease glucose conversion. So what they found is people with diabetes who were taking this were healthier than people without diabetes who weren't taking it. Okay. And they said, I wonder if there is some other mechanisms by which this drug is working that is making people healthier and protecting health span. So, the big study, the TAME study, hasn't actually started yet. They're still working on funding, which is looking at metformin as an anti-aging medication. There was a lot of excitement about this. And I think in certain populations, it's probably still beneficial. And those are probably the populations that can't exercise. Okay. One of the big side effects of metformin is lactic acid production. And so in the operating rooms, we would stop metformin before people are coming in for surgery just because of the risk of lactic acidosis. Okay. And so if you're able to exercise and you're an intense exerciser, it's probably not the best drug to be taking. Okay. And so I think the studies, again, haven't panned out the way we thought. I think there was a lot of excitement, but it just hasn't had quite the effects that people were thinking.
Okay. And again, the last one, rapamycin. We're also getting a lot of conversation in this longevity space.
And I think we have the best data right now around rapamycin. So again, rapamycin's been around for a really long time. It's used as a part of an immunosuppression cocktail in transplant patients, which is how it is most of the time used clinically. It itself is probably in isolation, not as much as an immunosuppressant, but more of an immune modulator. So it works by inhibiting what we call mTOR1, which mTOR is an enzyme enzyme in a process when in abundance leads to cell growth. So when there's an abundance of fuel around, mTOR says grow, build, etc. Rapamycin is an mTOR1 inhibitor. mTOR is a protein that when around, and there's an abundance of fuel, we build. Okay. Cells grow, we build things. Okay. So when we inhibit that, we cause a process called autophagy.
Right. Okay. Now that I've heard a ton about. If you're fasting or other things, it always says, because it helps stimulate autophagy.
Yes. Okay. So autophagy is basically cleanup. Right. It's cleaning up the debris. Okay. It's recycling cell parts and organelles that have either been overused, aren't working anymore, and kind of cleaning up. And that's good. And we think when we use autophagy, we clean up inflammatory markers, we clean up all of this debris, and therefore have more space, energy to start it's kind of like spring cleaning.
Take out your trash.
Exactly.
Declutter. Okay.
Exactly.
I get that.
So that's kind of rapamycin's role in aging. And they think it helps also repair DNA and prevent DNA breakdown. So rapamycin's probably the one drug that across species has shown to not only promote lifespan, but promote health span. Okay. And it's probably the one drug that in multiple different trials, so the aging scientific community participates in something called the ITP, which is basically lots of different labs doing the same experiment to see if they get similar results. Yeah. And rapamycin's the one drug that's producing pretty consistent results in different labs, meaning it's probably a more true finding. Yeah.
But you were also talking about it's being trialed in something other than mosquitoes and flies.
Yes. Right? So Matt Chamberlain out of the University of Washington is doing a dog study, a companion dog study. And what's really interesting about that is those are probably, if we think about our companion dogs, they live in our environment. They breathe our air, they drink our water, they're around the same pollutants, they're exposed to the same chemicals that we are. So I think that, it's really interesting to see, and those studies the results of those studies haven't been released yet, but how are these dogs, are they living longer? Are they staying healthier? And how will that transition to humans? I think rapamycin also has a really good safety profile in humans. We've used it a long time. I think the things that we're still working on are dosing.
And then some side effects, maybe like a little bit.
Yeah.
Headaches or
some people have had a little headache and stomach ache. Overall, it's pretty well tolerated, to be honest. I think the dosing is, do you take a dose once a week? A higher dose, what is that dose? We're not quite sure. How long do you take it before you cycle on and off? And so there's, if you look it up, there's lots of different regimens. I don't think we have a right one yet. I think we need more information about that. And then the one study we have in humans was done in an elderly population where they looked at the response to flu vaccine. And as we age, we don't respond as well to vaccines. And the people taking rapamycin had a more robust immune response. So
but all of these are things that you just don't go to your drugstore and get over the counter, right? So this is also in the show notes. How do you talk to your doctor about this? How do you get a prescription for this if you want to try rapamycin? It's not coming up like, I need my vitamin C.
Correct. So these are all conversations to have with your healthcare provider, and based on your risk factors, et cetera.
Okay. So I think we've kind of thought about the pharmaceutical side of emerging modalities. I know there are a lot of lifestyle levers, and I think we're going to go deeper into these in different episodes, but the ones that seem to be getting the most conversation are contrast therapy, like saunas and cold plunges, and that merits a deep discussion because, especially for women, and when would you do a cold plunge, and what time of day, and then fasting or eating, moderated and modulated eating windows. And again, that one feels like a whole deep dive too.
Absolutely.
They're potential levers that can help on health span in combination with longevity.
Right. And I think a lot of these things depend on your ability to be active. And I think we talk about exercise mimetics a lot. Like, what is an exercise substitution? And we know that exercise is best. If you can't exercise, doing things like sauna is really helpful. You can get a lot of the same exercise effects without exercising. So maybe if you're injured or using them and kind of as alternatives for short term can be helpful. There's other benefits to sauna as well, but I think a lot of these things that we think are other tools and tricks are actually just an exercise substitution.
So when you talk about movement, because that just kicks off some of the 4 pillars, and as we get into these 4 pillars, one thing that always strikes me, I was in Bath, as they say in the UK, and visiting the old, Roman and Celtic ruins, and they have a sauna, a cold plunge, a gym, and a cooking center, 2,000 plus years old. So these are well known, well tried, and true things to do. So the first one you raised, which we'd say, hey, you know what? If you've got nothing else, move however you can, and we're going to do a bunch of episodes on the most effective movement, time of day, time of life, lift heavy, interval training. So all of that is up and coming. But even without all of that, just move.
Absolutely. And I think, we both prescribe to any movement is better than no movement. There's ways we can, quote unquote, optimize the way we move at different periods of our lives, but absolutely moving. And, it takes all different types of moving too. We talked about falls. It's balance, it's joint mobility, it's, it is strength, it is, endurance. It's all of those things together. And so finding activities that incorporate a couple different types of movement is great.
And I think the 2 kind of guidelines that changed the way I thought about exercise, because we've both exercised our whole life. It's not like a new thing to discover. But one was, when you're working out, if it's a 45-minute time, you're either doing this polarity of motion, so lifting heavy, or sprint interval training. And that's a great way to kind of filter what you're doing with those 45 minutes. But the second was, that does not constitute movement, right? That's working out, which is awesome.
Yes.
Already won. But then the rest of the day, you have to incorporate movement every hour. And there's all sorts of tips and tricks on timers and exercise snacks and things we'll get into. But if you don't have time to listen to those episodes, just put in your mind, moving throughout your entire day is as mission critical as the 45-minute workout.
And it's back to the little things, like park a little bit farther away from the store. I mean, it's take the stairs if you have the option. All of those things count. So I think we sometimes think we have to block off an hour here, or 45 minutes there, or 2 hours here. We need to be on a 4-hour bike ride. I mean, some of that is great if you have the time, but most of us don't. So it is taking those, and I love that term, exercise snacks.
Just moving. All right. What's the second one?
So sleep. And I think this has become just mission critical. And, people argue which one is more important. I think we stand by our movement, but I think sleep is definitely a close second, that we know our bodies need to repair. We know that for our cognition, sleep is absolutely critical to be able to have the capacity to handle stress, to be able to have the capacity to create new habits and try new things.
Right. And again, the spirit of 2 takeaways that are quick, no matter what. One was 8 hours is not 8 hours is not 8 hours, right?
Correct.
So you try to think about the 8 hours and map it to whatever your circadian rhythm is, but also map it to, you need to get it before a certain time at night so that you get deep sleep, and then you still have time for REM sleep. So there's 2 components of sleep, but I know you are a sleep expert and sleep expert for women brains, so we're going to have fun in that episode. But that was something that was like, oh, okay, I can't make up for it by just sleeping later in the morning, right? You got to chunk out those 8 hours. And then the second part that is kind of like exercise snacks is there is a role for napping.
Absolutely.
I mean, even as little as 6 minutes. There's studies that show that matters too. So it's not like you wake up in the morning and go, oh my gosh, I didn't get my 8 hours, I'm done for the day. You can actually plug in a little 20-minute nap and get the net positive there.
Absolutely. And I think, consistency is key. If we're just going to leave it at that for today, consistency is key. And so trying to find very similar sleep windows day in and day out is really important, because you're exactly right. It then relates to the quality of our sleep, which is just as important as the quantity.
Okay, the third pillar, nutrition, or nourishing. There's so much conversation about what diet is right, and I think luckily for us, we don't feel like any diet is right. There's not a specific diet that's right. There are diet components or nutrition components that are important. Protein being kind of job one. We talk about that a lot, and we'll get into the why and what qualifies as a full protein. The other thing that I think gets lost a little bit in the conversation is, if you think about body comp, and that's what a lot of midlife women are struggling with, is that extra abdominal weight, etc. That's tackled through nutrition. You can't exercise your way out of that. Exercise is your energy and your soul fuel and your cognition and your medicine for all of those 4 horsewomen. But if you're thinking about body comp questions, it's in the nutrition pillar, right?
And I think that comes back to, like, you must fuel yourself to build lean muscle, which then lowers that fat. And so it is counterintuitive. It's not a calorie in equals a calorie out anymore. And I think it's a theoretically difficult concept.
It is,
right?
Because it's been ingrained in our heads since we were teenagers. It's and a lot of that we're going to go deep into this in the nutrition episode. A lot of that is probably the food industry.
100%.
Right? Saying, hey, so this many calories, you can mix it however you want. Just make sure you work it off.
Right.
Which is just not real.
Not real. And so I think that, the protein consumption and just the whole food consumption becomes really critical in a society where we've been told to not behave that way.
Right.
So kind of overcoming those stereotypes and those cultural and societal standards that have been set for women. We need to eat.
And so if we were going to simplify a couple of things here, it might be, you need to eat in the morning. If you're going to, it kicks off your metabolism.
Yep.
And I think a lot of us grew up in a dynamic where it was like, get your workout in and don't have eaten before it.
Right.
So we're going to get into the mechanics of that. And then the other part is, it's okay to stop eating, 3-4 hours before you go to sleep so that you get a good night's sleep.
Right.
So there's a little bit of that timing in addition to eat more protein.
Right. And I think the other part of nourishment that we'll obviously go into more deeply as hydration.
Yep.
Is being hydrated. And what does that mean? What does that look like? And, the quick answer is plain water usually doesn't cut it. You need some electrolytes for your body to actually absorb the water effectively and efficiently. So putting, even if it's as simple as a little bit of salt in your water. And it's not even to the point you need to taste it. Just a little bit of salt will help your body absorb the water. And then supplements, which is, I think, a big thing, especially for women transitioning through perimenopause and into menopause. What supplements do we need? What does our body really need at that point? What's worth taking and why?
Yep. That could be like 3 or 4 episodes.
Oh, easily.
There's so much conversation.
So much conversation about that.
So the last pillar?
Connectivity.
Yes.
So there's beautiful studies out of, the Nun study that you love so much and the happiness study out of Boston. Really, one of the keys to a long, happy, healthy life is having strong human connection.
Strong human connection, community. And the fundamental question for all of this is the purpose and how we iterate on purpose.
Yeah.
And how we iterate on the why. So those are, we got a lot of stuff to cover.
We do. Yes. And so just to kind of wrap up for everybody, this idea of longevity, our goals are matching our health span to our lifespan as much as possible.
Yes.
So it's kind of reverse engineering. What do we want to be doing 10, 20, 30 years from now? And knowing how our bodies are going to age. There's no stop. There's no magic.
Right.
But what can we do to prepare for that natural rate of decline? Maybe slow that natural rate of decline a little bit.
And off of a higher base, right? Yeah. Build up a base so that decline is landing you in a spot that feels like a fun place to land.
Correct. So working through that and then going back to the fundamentals. And I know it sounds like we're just talking about the same things over and over and over again, but the beautiful part is they help you now and they ensure that you're going to be better later on.
Awesome. So that is what we love talking about, is how to live better right now.
Yeah.
And for the long haul.
And for the long haul.
Yes.
All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for spending your time with us here today. If you liked what you heard and you got some tips on how to live better right now and for the long haul, please help us reach more midlife women. Please share and rate and like this show. And we can't wait to continue the dialogue with you on our next episode. Until then, thank you. It's time.